Good evening to everyone, and welcome to Deconstructing the Entanglement, Race and the Justice System. I am Dr. Ingrid Whitaker, Associate Professor of Sociology in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice at Old Dominion University. And I will be introducing President Broderick of Old Dominion University. I'd like you to know that after I introduce the president, the next voice you will hear is that of Dr. Broderick, the president, and then after Dr. Broderick, we'll hear from Dr. Mona Danner, who is the chair of the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice. It is now my honor to introduce the 8th president of Old Dominion University, John R. Broderick. Under his leadership, since 2008, Old Dominion has emerged as an innovative research leader in fields from flooding resiliency to bioelectrics, and the university recorded the highest graduation rate in its history. ODU also remains among Virginia's most affordable four-year schools and among the most diverse and inclusive. In the past 2 years, he received the President's Award from the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators and the Community Leaders Award from the Urban League of Hampton Roads. President Broderick chairs the Council of Presidents of Southeastern Universities Research Association. During his tenure, Old Dominion has received nearly $930 million in new resources, including the largest gift in its history, a $37 million donation to establish the Berry Art Museum. Most recently, Old Dominion received an additional $29 million from the state to increase the number of graduates as part of the Tech Talent Investment Program. At the request of students, the Kate and John R. Broderick Dining Commons was named after the president and the first lady for spearheading inclusion initiatives and their commitment to student success. Ladies and gentlemen, President Broderick.
Well, thank you, Dr. Whitaker, and good evening to everyone. To our distinguished panel, to fellow monarchs, visitors and friends, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this timely conversation exploring the relationship between race and the justice system. Race in the criminal justice system in this discussion refers to the unique experiences and disparities in the United States regarding the policing, prosecution, and correctional control of people of color. This includes men and women, old and young, special needs populations, individuals with disabilities and/or mental health issues, and the list goes on and on. This conversation tonight is particularly significant given the global outrage, protests, and demand for racial and equal justice following the death of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer. Deaths of African Americans by police prior and subsequent to Mr. Floyd's death serve as a reminder of the long-standing history of systematic racism inflicted upon African Americans since the first landing of Africans in 1619, starting with slave codes and patrols. In a more contemporary history, passage of get tough legislation such as drug sentencing and 3 strikes are laws that disproportionately affect people of color and other marginalized populations and groups. Currently, the United States criminal justice system is the largest in the world. At year end, over 6.7 million individuals were under some form of correctional control, including 2.2 million incarcerated in federal, state, local prisons or jails. The Equal Justice Initiative notes that fueled by the war on drugs and tough on crime, mandatory sentencing policies, mass incarceration has a clear racial impact, given that 70% of the United States prisons populations are non-white. Specifically, according to Mark Maurer from the Sentencing Project, such broad statistics bring to light the racial disparity that pervades the United States criminal justice system, especially for African Americans. For instance, according to Mr. Maurer, African Americans are more likely than white Americans to be arrested. Once arrested, they are more likely to be convicted, and once convicted, they are more likely to experience lengthy prison sentences. African American adults, in fact, are 5.9 times as likely to be incarcerated than whites, and Hispanics are 3.1 times as likely. Also, according to a 2018 study by Pew, 1 in 23 African American adults in the United States is on parole or probation versus 1 in 81 white adults. And white Americans make up 13% of the US population. They make up 30% of those on probation. And I should restate that. And while African Americans make up 13% of the US population, they make up 30% of those on probation or parole. What's apparent from this data that I've shared with you this evening is this disparity exists across the broad spectrum of the justice system, from policing to sentencing to that of custodial control. I am pleased that at Old Dominion, we are taking the lead in hosting a conversation on deconstructing the entanglement of race and the justice system. We have distinguished panelists from each area of the justice system tonight, which include the legislature, judicial, law enforcement, and corrections. Our panelists will explore how racial disparity is manifested in the daily operations of the justice system, and most importantly, provide recommendations that can be taken to counter the negative outcomes of disparity in the justice system. Again, to our distinguished panelists, thank you for helping us make this webinar possible. I look forward to continued conversations in the future along these lines. I also want to thank the organizers and co-sponsors, especially Dr. Melvina Sumter, for taking the time to make this important event possible along with so many of her colleagues. I close with thanking the audience for being part of this necessary discussion. Please learn from this webinar focusing on race and the justice system. Again, I thank Dr. Whitaker for her kind introduction, and I know now the program is in good hands as I turn it over to Dr. Mona Danner.
Thank you, President Broderick. We very much appreciate your presence with us tonight. I wish to also thank all of you out there who are participating in tonight's conversation. And please understand that it is a conversation. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a space for Q&A. We will have time after our panelists speak to answer your questions. So please put your questions in that box. I'd also like to mention to you that we are live streaming on Facebook. If you'd like to view us there, it is facebook.com/ODUOCE. That's facebook.com/ODUOCE. And now it is my honor to introduce briefly our panelists for this evening. James Cervera is retired Chief of the Virginia Beach Police Department. Harold Clark is the Director of the Virginia Department of Corrections. Gerald Jones is a judge in the Norfolk Circuit Court. And Cornita Riley is retired Chief of Orange County Department of Corrections. I will ask each panelist questions, allow time for their answers. And as I mentioned again, please put your questions, dear audience members, in the Q&A box that you will see at the bottom of your screen. Let us begin tonight as we discuss deconstructing the entanglement of race and the justice system. And we'll begin tonight with Chief Riley. Chief Riley, we'd like for you to begin by providing an overview of your professional experience working in the justice system. That is, tell us who you are. Next, discuss the overall purpose of local departments of corrections. Afterwards, from your perspective regarding the issue of systemic racism, please discuss the intersections between race and the judicial system.
Well, good evening, good afternoon, first of all, and thank you all so much for providing an opportunity for this very appropriate and very serious conversation. And I'd like to thank Ms. Melvina Sumter for reaching out and asking me to participate in this discussion. First of all, in terms of who I am, I'll start with my background a little bit quickly in terms of my professional experience. A little over 37 and a half years working in the criminal justice system, spanning from probation and parole services through doing investigations related to probation and parole recommendations, moving into the state prison system for several years, and then finishing up my career in the local corrections environment at Orange County Corrections Department, and that's in Orange County, Florida, not Orange County, California. Let me make that distinction. In terms of other background, educationally, my background is from Florida State University for my undergraduate work and from the University of Central Florida for my graduate work. But my longtime passion and continued focus is within the criminal justice system, and specifically in that arena relating to corrections and how we facilitate opportunities for those that come into the custody and jurisdictions within the detention or facilities to improve their lives and to provide opportunities for those who want to do better to be able to do better if they are provided the right resources to do so. With regard to my perceptions in terms of the intersects with racism and the issue, systemic racism and the intersection between race and the judicial system, my perspective, of course, being colored from the fact that I grew up African American, have worked in a system where I have seen the disparity in treatment with regards to sentencing practices. My perspective is one that is colored by those experiences. And I believe that until we as a nation are willing to have these types of discussions and have them on a level playing field and to have them based on truth, have them based on fact, have them not rooted in denials, that we're never going to get to a place where we're able to get to real solutions. This is a very, very difficult conversation to have. And oftentimes I've found even within the corrections environment, at the local level where the focus is detaining those that have recently been arrested, and generally those who have maybe been sentenced to maybe short jail sentences and not long-term prison sentences, I find that you want to make sure that the people that are coming into your custody understand that they have rights and that those rights have to be addressed in a way that people understand they should be across the board and not just for those that can afford private attorneys versus those that may have to have an attorney assigned to them. Of course, when we don't get it right at the local level jurisdiction and people sit in our custody and then they are sentenced, if they're sentenced beyond a local detention facility, then they're into a state system. Once they're into that state system, we're now dealing with sentences that are going to keep them far longer than being in a local jail. And we're dealing oftentimes with individuals working in systems that I have also seen not want to treat people based on their race, based on the color of their skin, or even based on their gender, not wanting to treat them also in the same fashion and wanting to give privilege to those that are not of color, even when it boils down to job assignments within a criminal justice system. So even when you're dealing with an inmate population, I have seen that disparity. So my perspective and reality on this is, having watched these kinds of disparate decisions being made, even within the correction system, and doing all that I could to help make sure that those that I was responsible for, whether it was the inmate population, and then after I was fortunate enough to continue to promote within the system of corrections, to educate those that were responsible for reporting under my command, help educate them into understanding what their responsibilities were and what they were not. That the responsibility of those working in the system for corrections was not to be the judge or the jury for those that we were required to provide care, custody, and control for, but to provide services and to assist those individuals in improving themselves, so that when they return back into the community, that they would have an opportunity to be law-abiding, productive citizens and integrate back in the community, hopefully with some skills under their belt, hopefully with treatment, if treatment was one of the issues that they needed. I do not believe that we are able to resolve the issues of race in the criminal justice system by pretending that we don't have disparate treatment and that we don't have disparity in sentences, that we don't have disparity in the decisions that are made for those that are able to participate in even the programs that are made available when they're in custody. And I was fortunate enough to work in jurisdictions where we've had programs available and wanted to make sure that people were afforded an opportunity to participate. This is a very far-reaching issue. It is a deep issue, and I don't believe that you resolve things until you get to the root of the problem. And root causes have to be addressed if we're going to actually come up with meaningful solutions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chief Riley. Thank you. Chief Severa, we'd like for you to begin with an overview of your professional experience working in the justice system. And then afterwards, please discuss the overall purpose of policing. And then we'd like for you to conclude by sharing what is meant by the philosophy of procedural justice in policing. Why is an intentional focus on procedural justice important, especially for tonight's topic as we consider racial and other disparities associated with policing?
Dr. Danner, thank you. First, I would like to thank ODU for including me in such an esteemed group of folks who are speaking tonight. And also the fact that we're talking about the criminal justice system. It seems like a lot of attention is being paid to the police end of the criminal justice system. And we've just heard from Chief Riley how that also affects the corrections industry, and Judge Jones will talk for the sentencing. What I'd like to discuss is first, I'm a 44-year veteran of policing. I started in North Jersey, my home area. Interestingly, the first police job that I had, I was 20 years old. I received the appointment because in the city I applied to, the NAACP sued the city for improper hiring practices, and I got the job. So it was very interesting from the beginning. I bring that up because my first 2.5 years were walking a beat in a socially distressed neighborhood, a socially distressed area. We now call it a marginalized section of the city. And I learned a lot from everyone in that particular area where I worked. I was there every night walking. You get to know everyone. They get to know you. You get to realize that regardless of gender, race, religion, ethnic background, everyone has the same goals in life. One, most people just want to be left alone. Secondly, everyone wants that little slice of what we call the American pie. And third, all of us want our kids to do better than we've done. That was a great learning experience for me. I moved to Virginia Beach in 1978 and spent the next 42 years in the beach. Rose to the rank of chief. I've been blessed. It's an excellent organization. This is a fantastic region in which we live. And I'm just so thankful that in 1978, I got lost coming out of New Jersey and found my way to the Hampton Roads area. You asked, what is the overall mission of policing? If you speak to certain folks, especially to the legal end, they would say it's enforcing the law. I think we need to go way beyond enforcing the law in modern 21st century policing. I truly believe that cops are agents of social change. Now, how do I believe that? Why do I believe that? A number of years ago, we realized that we had some problems in our mental health system. Well, the answer was, well, the police will handle it with additional training. And we did, known as the CIT program. In Virginia Beach, we had a problem with homeless individuals, especially at the oceanfront. The police stepped up. We formed a working relationship with Human Services, formed a program there to assist the homeless folks at the oceanfront. We know that there was an opioid, there still is an opioid epidemic in the country. Judge Jones and I were on a task force with previous governor. And the answer to that was, well, the police need more training, they can handle it. It seems that whatever the social issue is in our country, the police are at the forefront. That is because police are the department of first resort, not last resort, but first. And they're the first department to interact with citizens. Just to give an example, in my young day, if we arrested somebody for prostitution, it ended with arresting the young female for prostitution. Today, what we look at is human trafficking. And what we do with the individual is get them the assistance they need, and then we open an investigation for the person who's trafficking that particular female. That is why I'm a firm believer that whatever the social issue is in America, somehow, some way, your police will be involved. Procedural justice. I have to go back to the 21st Century Policing Report of President Obama. Closely involved in it because the two individuals who led that group, Chuck Ramsey, who was superintendent of Philadelphia Police, and Roberto Villaseñor, who was the chief of police of Arizona. I just forgot the name of the city he was in. They were the leads on that program. The first pillar of 21st century policing is building trust and legitimacy in the community. We have to build trust with our community, and the community has to believe that the police are legitimate in what they do in order for everyone to follow the law appropriately. That's obvious. How do we get there? We get there by breaking down the barriers of communication. We get there by being open and honest. We get there by treating everyone equally across the board. We get there by giving everyone in the community equal access to the police department. And we get there by co-producing public safety. I know that that's a very nice academic term, co-producing public safety, but that's really what procedural justice boils down to. What else procedural justice tells us is, what is our mission? Is our mission outputs or is it outcomes? Well, for years in policing, it was outputs. How many arrests do you make? How many tickets do you issue? Then what happens is crime would go up, so we would issue more tickets, make more arrests. What we look at with procedural justice is what's the outcome? Well, the outcome is to reduce crime and to increase public efficacy in what we're doing. So therefore, we target what we need to do to make the community safer and more secure. But the final piece to this is not just an immediate outcome, but it's how do we get to an infinite outcome, an infinite result. And we're all talking about the health system in our country with COVID-19. Well, we know that there's certain diseases that do not exist anymore. It's been an infinite result in what the medical profession did. That's where we need to go with policing. If we continue to do that, if we continue to work with our communities, if we continue to build trust in our communities, then procedural justice will tell us that the community will assist in that co-production. Final note on that. It's very, I guess, easy to say we are transparent because we put everything on the internet that we do. And the Virginia Beach Police Department does that. But you know, most people don't go to the internet to read what the cops do. That's not high on their list. What it means is police officers, police administrators, police leaders need to get out of the office, get into the community, and speak to people on a one-on-one basis. You know, it's very hard to hate up close. And once that communication happens, the result would be better policing in the community. Follow up with a little quote by the Reverend Al Sharpton. The other day, he was asked about defunding the policing, and he made a comment that is specific to, and this is his words, latte liberals who sit in the Hamptons and think of these things. He said, when you're on the ground, people need policing, but they need the proper policing. So what we have done over a number of years with, and I'll get into community policing later, what we have done is re-engineered how we try to do our job. A cornerstone of value to all of this is procedural justice in reaching out to the community. And as Robert Peel said, the police are the community and the community are the police.
Thank you, Chief Cervera. Judge Jones, we'd like for you to begin as well with an overview of your professional experience in the justice system, and then to discuss the overall purpose of the judicial system. And then finally, to conclude with a discussion of how laws designed contribute to racial disparity in the justice system. And if you can give us an example or two, we'd appreciate that. And then building on that previous question, how does, I know I'm going to make it difficult for you, but you can do it. How does judicial discretion contribute to racial disparity in the justice system?
Well, good evening, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Danner, for that toss to me. You wouldn't want to insult me with any easy questions or, you know, just a little bit of subject matter to cover here tonight. But I'm happy, like my colleagues on the panel this evening, to be with you. Let me apologize. I'm having a little bit of difficulty with the setting sun over the Elizabeth River here in downtown Norfolk, and I'm hoping that the sun will set pretty soon because the sun is all on my screen here tonight. But this is the way it is. I guess this is about my 5th or 6th Zoom of the day because, as we know, we spend a lot more time virtually in communicating with people, and you will be interested to know, people would be interested to know that the coronavirus pandemic has profoundly and negatively impacted the ability of the court system to function, not only in Virginia, but all across the country. And we better be very cautious and careful as we move forward and allow virtual communication to substitute for actual personal interaction, and that we're having to really come to terms with our ability to do that in the courtroom and whether it really is fair to not have people physically present. But we're taking the health precautions, and that could be the subject of an entire session, quite honestly. I am to talk, I guess, a little bit about who I am and what my moral authority is to join this august group of panelists. If my mother were here, my dear departed mother of over 2 years now were here, she would say that I am one of the few persons in Virginia history to hold office in each of the 3 branches of government. I started practicing law in Virginia upon graduation from law school in 1980, and my first job was at the Supreme Court of Virginia. I integrated that court in the sense that I was the first African American to serve in the capacity as a law clerk to the justices of the Supreme Court of Virginia. A one-year appointment. After that, I returned here to Norfolk, to my home, having followed my father into the legal profession. He was one of the early and pioneering Black attorneys here in Virginia, 1949. But I followed him. He was deceased by the time I started practicing law, and I became an assistant Commonwealth attorney. For those who may not know, that's the state's attorney. That's the prosecuting attorney here in Virginia. I stayed there for 2 years, tried hundreds, if not thousands of cases. Great way to start practicing law, very much, in the trenches, and did all kinds of cases, serious and not so serious cases. After that, after 2 years of prosecuting, I joined with my who became my longtime law partner, and we started our own law firm, hung out our shingle and started practicing law. Something that people just don't do now because they really can't afford to practice law in that fashion. But we did, we never looked back, and we made a success of it. I did emphasize, my emphasis in practice was criminal defense, juvenile criminal defense, and domestic relations. I did other things too, but for the next long time, I practiced law. I was probably one of the, by the time I came to the bench, I was one of the top tier of criminal defense lawyers, at least I wanted to think I was, in this area. But along the way, I got interested in political matters, and in 1987, I ran for the state legislature, getting elected by a whopping 78 votes in November of 1987 in the primary, and got elected to the Virginia House of Delegates, and I took my oath in January of 1988. Citizen legislature, part-time legislature, but I will tell you, spent a lot of time in the legislature here in Virginia, and I'm proud to note as an aside, some of you may know that my son now is in the seat that I held for 16 years in the state legislature. He got elected almost 4 years ago. So I was a lawyer and a legislator. And then in 2002, I resigned the legislature about 16 years later when then Governor Mark Warner, now U.S. Senator Mark Warner, called me out of the blue one day and said, "Gerald, I really want you to come to work with me in the administration and become the director of our Department of Juvenile Justice." I had established a name because in 1992, 3, 4, 5, 6, when I was in the legislature, I chaired, among many of the committees that I chaired the Virginia Commission on Youth. And that was the time when the United States and Virginia was actively engaged in juvenile justice reform. And the system, not only in Virginia, but across the country, underwent significant changes. And so by 2002, when I got the call from Governor Warner, I was somewhat recognized as an outstanding authority on juvenile justice matters. I led the Department of Juvenile Justice, and I know that some of my former colleagues from DJJ Virginia are on this call tonight because I got an email today told me that they were going to tune in and watch me. I better do okay. But it was a privilege to do that, to be the person at the top of the system and dealing with the incarceration, the rehabilitation, and the transitional reentry of juvenile offenders, serious juvenile offenders here in Virginia. By chance, in 2005, a position on the Norfolk Juvenile Domestic Relations Court became open through the unfortunate death of a friend of mine, and I got a call, and they asked me would I serve on the juvenile court bench. I was honored. I accepted the appointment, and I served there from 2005 to 2008, when I got a call from then Governor Tim Kaine and asked me would I accept an elevation appointment to the Circuit Court of the City of Norfolk. I was honored, and that is where I serve today. So that's kind of my career, having been in the legislative, the executive, and now the judicial branch of government. And while I'm here in the judicial branch of government, I serve on any number of committees, having served with Chief Severo on a gubernatorially appointed commission looking at the drug problems that we were having in Virginia. So all that to say, I think that I can talk with a little bit of authority. I'm in my 41st year between the bar and the bench in the criminal justice system. So the questions about disparity, I mean, they are the statistics that President Broderick gave. I mean, that says it all. These are the numbers. The numbers do not lie. And so we have tremendous disparity. I mean, is race a factor in the United States of America? You betcha it is. We know it is probably the most salient factor in American society today. I mean, you look at the television, you look at the presidential debate, you look at the news, you look wherever you look, and you see race as a factor, a driving factor in how we live our lives in our communities and across this country. Are there historical differences? You betcha there are, particularly here in Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. We suffer and live with that, and the Confederate flag, and all the disturbances that we've had about the flag and the tearing down of the monuments, and all those things that have occurred since George Floyd's death prior and subsequent to the other people who have unfortunately lost life. So to say that we can somehow ignore it or disregard it or somehow it's not a problem is absolutely ludicrous. It is a problem. And does it affect us in the courtroom? Yes, it does affect us in the courtroom. One of the most glaring examples of disparity and how the law creates disparity and overrepresentation of African Americans and other people of color in the system, it's not so much a state issue, but it was a big federal thing. The crack multiplier. Remember when crack was the big rage in the country? Well, the federal people passed a law that said if you are caught possessing crack, then your sentence was multiplied 10 times over what it would be for the same amount or the same potency of powder cocaine. Well, what was the problem with that? The problem was crack was cheap and crack was available and accessible to lower income people of color. So they ended up getting charged, convicted, and incarcerated at rates that were 10 times as high as a corresponding person who only had the powder cocaine. There are some other examples of that, but I use that as just the most kind of glaring, easy way to think about it. And the federal government was asked to change it time and time and time again. You had federal judges, some of whom even resigned their positions because they refused to enforce that rule or enforce the sentencing guidelines that went along with those very onerous drug laws. So that's just one example. And another thing that you've talked about here is judicial discretion. How does that contribute to racial disparity in the justice system? I'll close my part here with this. I mean, let's think about it. People who are judges like me, they don't just kind of get to be a judge overnight. They have had a walk through life. They have lived their lives. They see things through certain eyes. They see things through using a sensitivity and a sensibility that is, who they are. And so the process by which we exercise judicial discretion, who gets remanded to custody and who does not get remanded to custody, who gets to go off to rehabilitation and counseling, and who has to go to jail or prison and get locked up with Mr. Clark there. I mean, those are discretionary decisions that are made each and every day by judges in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I but one. I bring my walk through life to that process. We have sentencing guidelines, which let's come back to in the Q&A. But the sentencing guidelines guide us, but they don't tie our hands. They are guides. And so how you exercise that discretion is really the product of who you are, which is why it is so important, I would say, to everybody who's listening here tonight, who is a judge, who gets to be a judge, is a huge issue for us, and you need to be concerned about it. And how they get there. It is political. Does it begin at the ballot box? It does in Virginia. It does, I think, in many states where there's direct election of judges. Ours is not direct election. So, I mean, there are many aspects to who is exercising the judicial discretion. So you ought not be surprised sometimes when and I got an example from Florida about judicial discretion, but we'll come back to that when I have more time to talk. I don't want to go on any further. But anyway, thank you for allowing me to participate, and I look forward to any questions that I may be able to offer some insight on. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you, Judge Jones. Director Clark, we'd like for you to begin with an overview of your professional experience and then discuss for us the overall purpose of corrections. And if you would also then share with the audience what the offender population demographics typically look like in corrections and why you believe this is the case.
Hey, well, first of all, Dr. Danner, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this illustrious panel. I'm really happy to be here and to be a part of this conversation, which I think is not only timely, but it's very necessary. So a little bit about me. I began my career in corrections after our college in Nebraska in 1974. I started as a counselor at the Nebraska State Penitentiary. And between 1974 and 1987, I had approximately 11 promotions, advancements that landed me in 1987 as the warden of the Nebraska State Penitentiary, which was the maximum custody institution in that state. I served as a warden for only 3 years, from 1987 until 1990, when I was asked by the governor to serve as her director of corrections. So I accepted that post, and I served as director in Nebraska from 1990 until 2005. When I thought I'd been there too long, I needed something to do differently. And so I accepted the position of Secretary of Corrections in the state of Washington. And so I moved off to Washington State, where I served for approximately 3 years before I got ditched to move back again to the East Coast. And so I accepted a position to leave Washington and to go to Massachusetts, where I served as the commissioner of corrections for exactly 3 years before accepting an invitation from Governor Bob McDonnell to come to Virginia in 2010 to serve as the director of corrections here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So I've had a flavor of corrections pretty much across the United States. In my position as director, I was able to travel extensively to other state jurisdictions, and I also served as an auditor for many, many years for the American Corrections Association. So I got to go into state prisons, local operations, and also federal prisons and private prisons to audit those against the standards of the American Corrections Association. So I got a lot of insight into the differences that exist out there in the private sector versus state versus local corrections. In response to your next question, we can get back a little bit more about my experiences in my career later on, but in terms of the purpose of corrections, I think, simply put, it's public safety. Corrections is public safety, but that's our mission. But how do we achieve it? How do we achieve public safety? I like to describe it in two ways. One, we can achieve public safety by simply incapacitation, but I refer to that as temporary public safety, because that's only lasting as long as those measures and those controls are often in place, either effective supervision in the community or prevention of escapes and so forth in the well-managed prisons. But we need to go beyond that incapacitation. And that's why I believe the focus ought to be on long-term public safety. And that long-term public safety comes with change. It comes with treatment. It comes with learning. It comes with helping the offenders, the wards of the state, to understand their deficits, to understand their shortcomings, and to be able to change. I like to describe what we do in Nebraska, I'm sorry, in Virginia, as not just simply public safety, but I like to say that what we do is basically we are in the business of helping people to be better. And I speak about staff and I speak about the offenders when I make that comment, because as we help staff to be better, as we work on the culture and address all the cultural stuff that interferes with our ability to be successful, when we do a better job at that, then we are in a better position to work with the offenders and help them to become better citizens and better equipped to go out and to be able to access the legitimate economy. So turning on some information about the offender population demographics. Well, the issue of race has been mentioned, and I need to share some information about that. In Virginia, 42% of the inmate population is Caucasian, compared to 57% of Blacks making up that number. That is, 57% of the population is Black, 42% is Caucasian within the prison system. You contrast that with the population at large, where 61% in Virginia at large are Caucasian and 19% Black and 20% other. You take a look at the education, and I should also say that that mirrors the nation as well. Virginia is not an outlier, because if I were to share national numbers with you, nationwide, 31% of those incarcerated are Caucasian, compared to 32% Black and 37% other. So the numbers are mirrored across the country. When it comes to education, the vast majority of the inmates in our systems are reading at or below the 9th grade level, and they're doing mathematical computations at about the 6th or the 5th grade level, and often below. 31% of those incarcerated, on the average, have a mental health diagnosis. And if we were to take out the women and just take a look at females, 60% of the females in the system have a diagnosed mental health disability, and right about 18% of all of the offenders in our system are on some type of psychotropic medication. 80%, again, just sharing numbers, of those incarcerated, it is said, have a substance abuse issue. Either they're serving serving sentences for substance abuse, or they have a history of substance abuse, and that often drives the behaviors that tend to get them in trouble and to get them where they are. So you ask the question, why is this the case? What causes that? Well, I think Judge Jones made a good argument for that. It's a whole lot of different things, to include bias, deliberate bias, prejudice, racism, bad decision making because of the situation that one finds him or herself in. So a number of things contribute to that. But I think largely what I see impacting a lot of minorities is the lack of opportunities. They get off to a bad start and they don't see a future, and they make bad choices, bad decisions. You know, I happened to be in Tennessee not long ago, and I went to a juvenile detention center, and they were housing individuals from about age 16 up to about 25, 26 years old in that center. And I went into a very large day room where they had a couple hundred individuals just milling around, playing cards and so forth. So I made my way between them and asked them questions about their future and where they see themselves going and so forth. And to my amazement, those young men shared with me that they don't have any time to do that, to think about the future. They said if they get to age 25, they are on borrowed time. So how do you change that? How do you shift that? If they get to age 25, they are on borrowed time. So we have a major, major challenge before us. And I'll be glad to talk with you a little bit more in terms of how we are addressing that issue in the Virginia DOC and the type of outcomes that we're getting. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Clark. Chief Cervera, how can police agencies reduce the likelihood of racial and other disparities And I'd like to also for you to talk about how can policing be reimagined in the current climate in terms of national incidents of unrest, because we certainly need a stronger partnership between officers and the communities they serve.
I'll start with the second part of that question first. We talked about Pillar 1 in the 21st century policing. By the way, President Obama did a fantastic job with that group that he brought together, but it fell a little bit short of what the major city chiefs were really looking for. What we really wanted was a complete look at the entire system to replicate what President Johnson did. Are you ready? In 1967. We have not had a complete look at the system since 1967. We've had piecemeal looks, but not the complete. So President Obama put together 21st Century Policing Task Force, did a fantastic job. We just need to take it to the next level. Pillar 4 of that is community policing and reducing crime. Community policing is basically getting the officers into the community to try and fix a small problem before it becomes a major problem. It's also, how do you redo things without having to make an arrest? We do not want to take everyone that we interact with to see Judge Jones and eventually to see Mr. Clark. The object and the intent is, can we fix a problem without having to resort to an arrest? Now, that sounds really very philosophical. However, you know, if there's a violent felon, there's a violent felon, and police have to do what they need to do. We're talking a lower level arrest. You know, Judge Jones, you brought up the difference between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. We're very well aware of that. We also now look at that issue and try to say, if this person has a drug problem, can we design a drug court? Can we get them to that end so that they don't have to get incarcerated? What does that have to do with police? Again, we are at the forefront of a lot of these new programs that are being instituted, because for a community policing project to work, what we need to do is re-engineer how we're doing the job, get the buy-in from the community on how we're doing the job, and then deliver on what we say we are going to do. Let me just give a great example. Mr. Clark, you brought up juvenile justice. SROs first went into the schools in the mid-1990s. I was a lieutenant, and I started that program in Virginia Beach. And it met with a lot of resistance, by the way, from a lot of folks. Today, if that SRO calls in sick, the principal's on the phone to the precinct wanting to know who's going to take his place. What happened, though, was that the profession kind of resorted to arrest and summons for the kids, as opposed to, can we divert the kids? So now our deputy chiefs have met with the juvenile court diversion program, and we're taking a large number of these juveniles who would have gone to the court system into the diversionary program. The other great example of that is that we also designed a program with the school system to say, if a kid is caught with a substance, alcohol, marijuana, at one time they were automatically expelled from school. Well, Mr. Clark brought out, if you expel somebody from school, they're now functioning illiterate, and we know the more you educate, the less you incarcerate. So we designed a program with the schools to say, keep them in school, get them the help that they need. And if things work out when they graduate, that file goes away, so to speak. This is what we mean by reimagining how police do work. The other piece to this, we in the police world are the absolute poster child for the worst examples of how to market your product. The general public does not know what a lot of police officers do. We need to market our product that way a little better, to say, by the way, at 3 o'clock in the morning, when there's a violent situation going on, the cops are coming. Why? Because they're coming. There's a virtue to them coming to that situation. Second piece to this, and I'm a very strong believer, increasing training and education for the police profession. Let's professionalize this. In the state of Virginia, the minimum number of hours to be a certified police officer is 480 hours of training and 100 hours of field service. That's 580 hours. Now in Virginia Beach, we quadruple that. In the state of Virginia, to become a hairdresser, barber, cosmetologist, it's 1,200 hours of training. So I have to look at that and I say, where are we going with, not that I'm taking anything away from other professions, please, nobody take that away. And in the shipyards, if you want to go from journeyman, from apprentice to journeyman, it's, are you ready? 2,000 hours of training. So 2,000 hours of training. But what you have said, the city, the citizens across our Commonwealth, for a police officer, it's 580. And then we will entrust you with all of the authority that you will have. The authority to take someone's property, the authority to take someone's liberty, and authority to use force to make an arrest. Final piece of that is in the state of Virginia. Are you ready? In 1966, a code was passed for tuition reimbursement for sworn law enforcement. It has never been funded. I went before the General Assembly this past year, and it was basically killed on a 9-0 vote in a subcommittee for appropriations. And I look at that, and then we now have where we are today across the country saying police need better education, police need training. So I think that's the third construct of this. I know I'm running out of time.
Can I?
Did we just lose him? Oh, Chief Severe, we just lost you. Okay, Director Clark, how do you effectively manage a diverse correctional population and reduce the
line of all of this is there should be standards that everyone should have to meet. If you can't meet the standards, you don't have a police organization. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Clark, how do you effectively manage a diverse population and reduce the likelihood of recidivism?
Very carefully. Now, I think we are faced with a number of challenges in managing our diverse populations. And a big part of our challenge is where prisons are generally placed across the United States. They're placed in remote locations, far away from the inner cities, far away from where the offenders come from and their families and so forth, for the most part. And so the people that are often working in those prisons, a lot of them are Caucasians from small towns, and those prisons exist to support those small towns. And many cannot relate with the prisoners. So often they're not interested in necessarily what is necessary to help that prisoner because they can't relate, they can't identify. So that's a major hurdle that needs to be addressed. The culture of correctional facilities must be addressed. And so we spend a lot of time tackling that. And we have done that, I think, very well here in Virginia. So you have to tackle the culture of the organization. Then you have to get staff to understand the impact of the decisions that they make on the overall mission and on the offenders as well. And so, but what we do just basically after managing the culture is we rely on the science. That the science, by that I mean the things that have been proven to work and have been researched. And you apply the science with fidelity. And when you do that with fidelity, then you're able to get good results. You know, and we have been very fortunate here in Virginia. We have led the nation for the last 4 years with the lowest rate of recidivism in the United States. Today, our rate stands at 23.1, while the national average is right about 41%, and the outlier out there is about 63%. And so we are very, very proud of that, but it takes a lot of work. And you have to measure how you're doing as well and be prepared to change if the outcome, if the research tells you that something must be done differently. But we have invested heavily in the culture of our organizations, the staff of the organizations, and investing providing programs and things that work, such as addressing the literacy issue. And we have done research in that to show that individuals who avail themselves of academic programs, just basic GED, are only reoffending at a rate of 19.1%. Now compare that to our overall average of 23.1. And even further, individuals who take career technical education programs and complete those are only reoffending at a rate of 13.7%. So we have really researched what we're doing. We have been very deliberate in the areas that we focus on, and it has gotten us results. And you cannot avoid the conversation about racial disparity. You cannot sugarcoat it. You cannot brush it under the carpet. You must address it with people, even though they feel sometimes rather uncomfortable with the conversation. But I think we help each other along the way when we make those conversations happen.
Thank you, Director Clark. And I just want to make sure that the audience heard what you said, that is for 4 years.
Yes.
Virginia Department of Corrections has had the lowest recidivism rate, that is returning to prison in the country for 4 years, half of what is the national average. And so what you're doing is clearly working.
Thank you.
Chief Riley, what solutions do you recommend to reduce the likelihood of racial disparity in the justice system?
Oh, that is truly a very, very tough question. And it's a question that requires a lot of thought, a lot of work, and it requires every entity within the criminal justice system working together, because no one part of the system can do it alone, because it is truly a system. We have law enforcement, as we said, on the front end. We then have the judiciary. We have the correctional environment. And prior to that, my colleagues have all touched on the issue of social background. And the reality is, I know when I was growing up, as I was coming up, one of the terms that I would hear oftentimes was that we are all products of our environment. But the reality is, though we may be products of our environment, we all know that with the right assistance, even those who have come from a very challenging background and environment can be provided a hand up, some assistance for those that would like to improve their situations and their conditions. And so in terms of solutions, in working with staff and over my career, I believed that it was important, number one, to recognize as the employer who you were employing, and for supervisors to understand the importance of monitoring and managing staff and ensuring that staff understood what the mission of the agency is, that they understand what the role each person plays, and that they understand that it is that individual person's responsibility to keep their own personal biases in check. Because we have culture that impacts every one of us, culture, background, experiences, exposure, those things color our judgment and our decision making. I think that our solutions have to start first and foremost with recognizing how we as an individual operate in our decision making, and that we are careful not to allow our biases to color the decisions that need to be made to be fair and just and impartial to those who we are there to serve. Because within the criminal justice arena, we are there to serve the individuals that come into our presence, and not to create more difficulty for them. In my career, I worked with people who seemed to think that when it was probation and parole, that their goal and focus was to find a way to violate a probationer or a parolee, as opposed to help them be successful. Working in the prison system, I found that sometimes I worked with individuals or were responsible for supervising people who did not think that their job included trying to identify the programs that an inmate needed. If there was a mental health issue, if there was a substance abuse history in their background, and most of them had those types of issues, then the job is to identify what their needs are and to then guide them and direct them into those programs. And then I also believe that we have to recognize that everyone that comes into these professions aren't cut out for these positions. They are not cut out to be the helpers and the caregivers for those that they are in contact with. For many people, it's a job that they ended up in. They were looking for something to do. Corrections was hiring, and they landed a job in corrections. Those are the people you have to have some very tough conversations with and help guide them into other areas that they are better suited for, because everyone isn't suited for this profession. So I would sum it up by saying that the way that I believe that we bring solutions to these problems, at least from my experience within corrections, is to deal with the realities of every role that the people that we come in contact with are playing, whether it's the staff, whether it's the inmate population, if it's our partners in law enforcement, if it's working with the judges, and to be able to have a dialogue where we come together collectively and make decisions that serve the entire criminal justice system in order to return people back to their communities, to our communities, better than when they were in the system or when they came to us.
Great. Thank you, Director Riley. Judge Jones, you've had quite a career and you have been around in many aspects of the legal and the justice system. I'd like you to just focus specifically on the legislature and the judicial system. How can each branch of government reduce the likelihood of disparity in the justice system?
Thank you for that question, Dr. Danner. Before I address that, I would like, this is where the limitation on the medium that we're in, because back when my friend Chief Severa was talking, I wanted to raise my hand like the obnoxious fourth grader on the front row, as he talked about, I think that a lot of people who may be watching this, Chief Severa, are very much concerned about, what Chief Riley has just said. I mean, there's so much power in her remarks, but I think that what I want to ask you about is, and I'm familiar with the 21st Century Obama Commission on Policing, and what we are experiencing in this country now is a feeling that the police are not our guardians. They are not our protectors, as they are our adversaries. There's more of a warrior mentality. And we have certainly seen that on television in recent days and weeks and months. And I have had this conversation with my police chief, Chief Boone, who I think is probably the greatest police chief next to you, President Company, in the country. And Chief Boone was one of those police chiefs, I think, who understands the difference that I'm referring to. And when our local Black Lives Matter demonstrations were taking place, Chief Boone was with the demonstrators trying to identify and communicate and empathize and sympathize with the pain that they were feeling. And I think there are a lot of people who are watching this would want to hear somebody like you comment upon, why do the police seem to be so much against us and willing to harm us as opposed to protect us? Is that a fair question?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I know you can handle it. That's why.
Yes, sir. And I think a lot of that, it's multifaceted. One, as I said earlier, we have done a terrible job of marketing what we do, because I have example after example where police officers do interact with the African-American community on an extremely positive realm. The second piece is culture of policing has been changing. And where it's changing now is that it's going from the warrior mentality to the guardian mentality. Now, that's a beautiful discussion that came up a number of years ago. It comes out of Plato's Republic, because the guardians were entrusted with the democracy. But there are times where the police officers also put their lives in extreme danger and jeopardy, and we know that that's a total different conversation. The third piece, I think, Judge, is that if we use the proper examples of where it's worked and get that information out better to the community, you will see that the police do an admirable job in attempting to reach the community, especially in this region. You mentioned Larry Boone. Kelvin Wright out of Chesapeake does a fantastic job. They're doing a great job over in Portsmouth. Steve Drew is doing a great job up in Newport News, Terry Salt in Hampton. One of the things that we brought in, Judge, a number of years ago is the concept of implicit bias. That is bias that's inside of you, somewhere deep inside, that we talk with the officers to say it's there. It's, by the way, it's human to categorize things. It's human to put them in places. Understand it so it doesn't affect your decision making. I would also like to say that to the public, because I wore a blue uniform for 44 years. I don't wear it anymore. It's tough not to lump me in when you see a case like in North Charleston, where the police officer shot the man in the back 6 times as he was running away. I hope that answers. I hope to go one step further. I know that the police chiefs in this region are open to saying, let's take this to the next level and let's build on the public trust and legitimacy through the procedural justice.
Thank you very much. I just didn't think we could tiptoe around that, because I know that people would say, how come we didn't talk about that? Now, Dr. Danner, I will be very brief in explaining what I think the legislature of Virginia can do with respect to making the situation about eliminating racial disparity a little bit better, at least insofar as the courtroom is concerned. A little bit of history. The history is in Virginia, quite a number of years ago, we adopted criminal sentencing guidelines. In fact, Virginia was one of the first states in the country to adopt criminal sentencing guidelines. What are they? They are an objective matrix of factors that a person brings to the criminal proceeding at the sentencing phase, based upon prior criminal history, based upon whether it was a violent crime or a nonviolent crime. Was there a gun used? Was there not a gun used? That kind of thing. A matrix of factors that are calculated, and then they are measured against the statewide average sentencing practice on that particular offender. What would a judge do in Wise County, Virginia, versus what would a judge do in Norfolk, Virginia? Because what happened for years was disparity, discrimination, racism, by race, gender, geography. You were sentenced you got a more harsh sentence this place because you were a man, because you were, Black, whatever it was be. So 30 plus years ago, we tried to eliminate that kind of sentencing practice in Virginia and develop these sentencing guidelines. They're not mandatory like they became in the federal system, but they are guidance. They're voluntary. And if there is and they recommend a sentencing range from low to middle to high point, and you are supposed to, generally speaking, judge this case within that range. So we tried to move away from race and ethnicity and gender as a sentencing factor. You shouldn't get a lesser sentence because you're a woman, that kind of thing. But what we have found is it has resulted in the fact that we have no data on the sentencing practices. And so you have judges who may be departing upwardly from those sentencing guidelines, and we can't tell why that is. Are Black defendants being sentenced more harshly in terms of departures and that kind of thing? So one of the things that is being strongly recommended to the legislature, which, as you know, is in special session as we speak, convened by Governor Northam to deal with some of these issues, is recommending that we begin, as a matter of sentencing, to collect, analyze, and report on the sentencing outcomes by race and ethnicity. Seems a little peculiar that we're now talking about race again all these years later, but I think we need to do that to force our attention so that we understand where we are and what we must do to eliminate it. There are other things that we can do, but that would require legislative mandate in Virginia to collect that data. And I would strongly urge the legislature to do that. So I just want to throw that in, and others may have other ideas about that.
Thank you, Judge Jones. Go ahead, Chief Severa.
Judge, I'm glad you brought up the data collection that you just mentioned. We do that in policing.
Yeah.
In the city of Virginia Beach, we could tell you by race, by age, by gender, and also by home of record, everyone who's arrested. And we take great pride in that. And we go before our Human Rights Commission and our city council twice a year with all of that data to make sure that we are as open as we possibly could be.
I bet you not very many localities are doing it quite like that.
No, sir, they're not. But we'll,
I want to tell the panelists this, and that is that your conversation, the things you have said, have so captured our audience that we have more than 24 questions, some of which are several sentences long that delve into a variety of important policy potential changes or solutions. And so it occurs to me that as we talk about deconstructing the entanglement of race in the justice system, that you all know the system, and you know the system very well, and you particularly know your aspect of the system, the ones that you have decades of experience in. If you had to consider the single most important policy change that you would argue for, that you would spend time focusing on, what would that be? And within this, as you make your comments, I encourage you also that you can react to one another. I think I'd like to throw it open in that kind of spirit at the moment. Go ahead, Judge Jones. Unmute yourself, sir. You're muted.
I'm happy to yield to other members of the panel, but I mean, since you've asked that question, one of the things I think that Virginia is particularly out of the mainstream on is felony disenfranchisement. Virginia has one of the strictest laws with respect to the restoration of a person's rights following conviction and punishment of a crime. And in Virginia, those who do not know, only the governor of the state, only the governor has the power to restore your right. Why is that important? Because when you become a convicted felon, there is a ceiling that is put on your head that affects your life so profoundly, and therefore everyone around you. There is blatant discrimination against convicted felons in every area. Let's just say employment. So after they have served their time in the Virginia Department of Corrections, they're coming back to home or coming back to the community. They have a hell of a time trying to reintegrate, and convicted felons, I will tell you, really catch hell. And so unlike other states where there is an automatic restoration of rights following your completion of your sentence, we don't do that in Virginia. Some people even don't disenfranchise at all. There are some states where you can vote while in jail or prison. I think some New England states are like that. They don't disable you in the way that we do in Virginia. And in Virginia, again, only the governor. Do you know the governor? Do you know the governor? How are you going to get the governor to know you and restore your rights? So I think we need to be very, very serious. When I was a legislator all those years ago, it requires a constitutional amendment, and others after me have tried to push that boulder up the hill. But now is the time for this to change in Virginia. So if that's the one single thing, my druthers, what would I druther have? That's what I'd rather have, because it's unfair, it's immoral, it's horrible what we're doing to people, making them punished for a lifetime for something they did when they were 18 years old, or even in Virginia, 14 years old. You can become a convicted felon with adult conviction at 14 years old and disabled. Before you even get the right to vote, you've lost the right to vote. So, I mean, these are the things that are real. And I see them every day, and I have lots to say on that, but that's what I'm throwing out for people to consider.
Thank you, Judge Jones. Chief Riley, I saw your hand up, please.
I certainly wholeheartedly agree with Judge Jones 100% with regard to restoration of a person's civil rights. There are lots of things I could choose. I'm going to focus my comments on the issue of staff and accountability and policies related to when you're having to work with labor unions, the correctional officers unions. And how oftentimes you find your hands tied with regard to the appropriate discipline given a particular infraction, particularly one that is so egregious that termination is in fact the only right and reasonable thing to do, particularly when it's related to a use of force case. But oftentimes you have a situation where, because of the union contracts, the labor agreements, you find yourself in a very difficult situation. And even if you terminate based on their rights and arbitration, you oftentimes find yourself as an agency having to bring those people back on board. They feel like they've got to win. It's been an egregious use of force case, and the cycle continues. Now, I'll be honest, in Orange County, we were able to work very well with our union, over many, many years. But there are still areas of difficulty in other jurisdictions that are far more difficult than in Orange County, Florida, where those labor contracts are in place. And it's sort of what you've heard with regard to law enforcement with Officer Bill of Rights and the union contracts and the agreements, where it's just so difficult to address the issues from a disciplinary standpoint and to weed the bad apples out of your agency. And so for me, that would be the single most policy change, because I know it has such far-reaching effects, and we are able to address it in areas where we don't have the union contracts to govern the discipline, where you can be fair, you're impartial, you have a matrix, you have a history. But with regard to the correctional officers and those union contracts, that's where I would place a lot of emphasis.
Thank you, Chief Riley. Director Clark, you're up.
Yeah, I want to say that I also agree wholeheartedly with Judge Jones in terms of restoration of rights, because we work really hard to get folks resettled, re-entered back into the community. And when they go out there and they cannot find jobs, when they go out there and they can't even vote, they don't feel like a complete and a full citizen. And so I totally support that. I think it's something we need to work on. But I would also like to add that an area that I think we need to focus on is an area of compensation for staff, because we have great difficulty attracting staff and then retaining them as well. And so a lot of good people that want to work in this field can't really afford to stay in this field because of other things in life, and they have to move on. So I think compensation, so that we can attract and retain the right people, speaks volumes. Something we need to do.
Thank you, Director Clark. Go ahead, Chief Severa.
See, I guess I'm last. I brought it up earlier. I would like to see training and education increased dramatically, not only in our state, but across the entire country. I think it's time to professionalize policing, to give it that professional moniker. Quick anecdotal story. If a police officer is going to go get a search warrant, they go to the magistrate. Magistrate has to have a bachelor's degree, right, Judge? Then the police officer does the search warrant, has enough probable cause to get the arrest warrant, back to the magistrate with the bachelor's degree. Police officer puts the case file together, it goes to the Commonwealth attorney, bachelor's degree plus a 3-year law degree. The defense attorney, bachelor's degree, 3-year law degree. The judge, bachelor's degree, 3-year law degree. The judge decides that the individual could go to probation, bachelor's degree. The person who started the entire process, GED. So somewhere along the line, I think if we really want to look at policing, we need to look at it as a profession, not only the training, but the additional education. Training tells us what to do and how to do it, but education gives us the critical thinking skills to decide why are we doing this.
I've got to tell you that not only has this been a phenomenal conversation with people who are extraordinarily smart, extraordinarily experienced, thoughtful, but also kind and concerned about the people they serve. And so I really thank our panelists, Judge Gerald Jones, Director Harold Clark, Chief James Cervera, and Chief Cornetta Riley. You all have really done a phenomenal job tonight in helping us deconstruct the entanglement of race and justice in the justice system. I also want to thank our audience members. We are still getting questions, and I would love to be able to be here with you for, we could talk for days, and especially with panel of this quality. And so I want to thank our audience members who stayed with us to think through these very challenging topics in a particularly challenging time. We all hope for a much better present as well as future. As we wrap up tonight, I want to remind you that this has been recorded and will be available on the Office for Community Engagement website. I want to give thanks to the Office of the President at Old Dominion University, the Office of Academic Affairs, the Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, the Office of Community Engagement, and the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice. To our audience members and to the panelists, thank you very much and good evening.